Montana Territory, December 1876. The wind screamed through the trees as snow fell fast and hard, covering the world in white. In a one-room cabin tucked beneath the cold shadow of the Bitterroot Range, Beatrice Rowley pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's burning forehead and whispered prayers she was not sure anyone was listening to. "Kara, stay with me," she said softly, brushing tangled curls from the girl's face. "You are going to be all right." Kara, only 6, didn't answer. Her breath rasped, shallow and fast, and her skin burned with fever. Beatrice's hands trembled as she wrung out the cloth again. The willowbark tea had not helped. Neither had the dried yarrow she'd boiled that morning. The girl needed real help. Medicine, warmth, food. But the nearest town was over 30 miles away, and the snow had not stopped in 3 days. Beatrice stood slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling. She grabbed her father's old rifle from the wall. It had not fired in years, but it gave her comfort. She opened the door, wind slamming into her like a fist, and stared out at the endless white. Her cow had frozen to death the week before. The last of the dried venison was gone. Her daughter was dying. She did not cry. She had cried enough when her husband died 2 winters ago, caught in a blizzard on his way back from logging work. She had cried again when her neighbors left the valley last spring, heading east for easier living. But now she had no tears left. She stepped out into the snow, planning to check the traps she'd set near the tree line. There was no other choice. If she could not feed them, if she could not keep Kara warm, the mountain would take them both. She had only gone 50 paces when she saw him. A tall man on horseback, riding slow through the storm, snow bundled on his shoulders and hat, a rifle slung across his saddle. Beatrice's fingers tightened around her gun. The man saw her, reined his horse to a stop, and raised one gloved hand. "I mean no harm," he called over the wind. His voice was deep, sure. "Just passing through. Looking for shelter." Beatrice didn't move. "You're a long way from anywhere." He dismounted slowly and took a few careful steps forward. His eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his hat, and his face was marked by wind and years. "Name's Fletcher Rourke. Heading toward Fort Missoula. Got turned around in the storm." Beatrice studied him. He looked tired, honest, but she had learned not to trust faces. "I have a sick child inside," she said tightly. "I do not want trouble." "I do not bring any," Fletcher said. "But I can help. I know a bit about doctoring. Rode with a trail medic for 2 years." She hesitated. Every instinct in her said to send him away. But Kara coughed again from inside the cabin, wet and weak and barely there. Beatrice stepped back. "Come in," she said. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold. Fletcher entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. His gaze settled on Kara immediately, then flicked to the fireplace, where only a few coals glowed. "You are almost out of wood," he said. "I know," Beatrice replied. He crossed to the girl, kneeling beside her, checking her pulse with a practiced hand. "How long has she been like this?" 3 days, Beatrice said. "It started with a cough. Then the fever." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "She has pneumonia. She needs broth, warmth, and steam. Maybe mustard plaster if you have mustard seed." "I do not," Beatrice said, frustration rising in her chest. "I can make it work with what you have. But first, we need wood." "There is a stack out back." "Not enough," he said. "I will cut more. You stay with her." He was already shrugging off his coat and pulling gloves back on. Beatrice watched him step outside again, into the storm, and for the first time in days, she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Hope. Over the next 2 days, Fletcher worked like a man possessed. He chopped wood until his arms shook, fed the fire until the cabin sweat with heat. He boiled water, helped Beatrice strip Kara's sweat-soaked clothes, and held the girl gently when her coughing fits racked her small body. He made a poultice from pine needles and lard, wrapped her chest, and kept her head propped up just right. Beatrice never saw him rest. He moved with quiet purpose, never asking for thanks, never pushing too hard. When Kara finally opened her eyes and whispered a hoarse "Mama," Beatrice nearly collapsed. Fletcher gave her a quiet nod. "She will pull through." Beatrice leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to," he said, sitting down beside the fire. "I would not leave a child to die in the cold." Beatrice sat across from him. The firelight danced against the lines of his face. He looked older than her by a few years, maybe 32 or 33. There was something about him, his steadiness, the way he kept looking at Kara like she mattered, that tugged at her. "Why were you riding through this valley?" she asked. Fletcher glanced at her. "Looking for something quieter. I have been driving cattle for 12 years. Thought maybe I would find a place worth staying." Beatrice gave a dry laugh. "You chose the wrong mountain." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But then again, maybe not." That night, they shared a cup of weak tea and a thick silence. Kara slept between them, breathing easier, her fever down. Outside, the wind howled, but the cabin was warm. Fletcher sat close enough that Beatrice could feel the heat of him, and when his hand brushed hers by accident, neither of them pulled away. She looked at him, then really looked. His eyes were the color of worn leather, steady and kind. His hands were rough, his coat torn at the shoulder. But he had saved her child. He had not asked for anything in return. She had not expected anyone to come. She had not expected help. But now, sitting beside him, something inside her began to thaw. "You could stay," she said quietly, "until the storm passes." Fletcher looked at her, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. "I will stay as long as you need me." And somehow, she believed him. By the third morning, the wind had stilled. The snowfall eased into a hush, and the sky lightened from iron to pearl. Beatrice stepped outside to draw water from the creek, her boots crunching through the crusted snow. Ice creaked beneath her weight as she leaned over the hole Fletcher had cut the day before, steam rising from her breath. Her hands were stiff, but her heart was steadier than it had been in weeks. When she returned, Fletcher had pulled Kara's cot closer to the hearth and was stirring something in the kettle. The scent of dried onion and rabbit rose in the warm air. "She kept her broth down," he said, not looking up. "Color's better today." Beatrice set the bucket down. "I think she recognized me this morning. Just for a second." Fletcher nodded. "That's how it starts. Minute by minute." She watched as he ladled the stew into a tin bowl, setting it on the hearthstone to cool. His movements were quiet, deliberate. He didn't fill the room with talk, which Beatrice found she liked. He stood and stretched, the hem of his shirt lifting slightly above his belt. His ribs showed faintly beneath his skin. "You're not eating enough," she said. "There's not much to go around. I'll split the stew with you. You've still got less meat on you than I do." Beatrice raised her chin. "That's not how this works in my house." Fletcher met her gaze, then gave a short nod. "All right." They ate in silence. Steam curled from the bowls as the fire popped, and Kara breathed gently behind them. Beatrice watched the snow melt from Fletcher's boots, pooling beneath the bench. He'd patched the heel with rawhide and twine, the stitching neat but worn. "You've done this before," she said. He looked over. "Done what?" "Gone too long with too little." He shrugged once. "Comes with the trail. You weren't always alone." "No." She waited, but he didn't say more. Outside, the sun cracked through the clouds, casting long lines of light across the floorboards. Beatrice stood and unlatched the shutter, letting the pale warmth spill in. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the windowsill, worn soft in the center where she'd rested her hands many times. Fletcher finished his stew and leaned back against the wall. "What's east of here?" "Flatland. Then the river." "Then nothing for a long way. You ever think of leaving?" Beatrice turned from the window. "I thought about it. When Sam died, I thought maybe I'd walk east with Kara. But there's no one waiting, and no place that's mine but this one." He studied her. "You built all this yourself?" "After the spring thaw, I moved the logs from the old barn. Used what I could salvage." Fletcher gave a slow nod. "You did it right. The joints are tight. Roof's holding better than most I've seen." She looked away, but the praise sat warm in her chest. "I learned out of necessity. My neighbors were gone by then. Hard to do alone. Harder not to." The fire settled into a steady crackle. Kara stirred, murmuring something in sleep. Beatrice crossed the room, smoothing the quilt over her daughter's legs. "You're good with her," Fletcher said quietly. "I try. Not just that. She trusts you. Even sick, she leans toward your voice." Beatrice touched her daughter's hair. "She's all I have left of Sam. I can't afford to fail her." Fletcher stood and walked to the window. He stared out at the clearing, where the snow lay undisturbed. "You haven't." She turned, surprised. "You don't know that." "I do," he said. "You've kept her alive through a mountain winter. You didn't run when it got bad. You kept the fire going, even when there was nothing left to burn but furniture." That's not luck. That's grit. Beatrice opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't used to being seen that clearly. Fletcher stepped away from the window. I'll check the snares before dark. Might be something worth skinning. She nodded, watching him gather his coat and gloves. At the door, he paused. I haven't had a reason to stay anywhere in a long time. That's changing. She didn't answer, but when the door closed behind him, Beatrice stood a moment longer, listening to the windless silence. Later, she found herself fixing the hem of her dress, fingers brushing stitches into place. The cabin was still quiet. Kara slept deeper now, her breath even. Beatrice set the needle down, crossed to the window, and watched Fletcher's shape move through the trees, steady and sure. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was holding the world up by herself. Fletcher returned with a hair slung over his shoulder and a flush of color in his face that hadn't been there before. He didn't speak as he entered, only nodded once at Beatrice and hung his coat near the fire, snow melting off the hem and darkening the floor. Beatrice stood at the table, turning over the last of the salt in her hand. That won't stretch far, she said, watching it fall into the little clay jar. I'll make do with less, Fletcher said, crouching by the hearth to skin the rabbit. His knife worked with practiced efficiency, clean and measured. She leaned against the table and watched without speaking. Kara blinked awake not long after and asked for water with a cracked voice that held more strength than it had yesterday. Beatrice guided the tin cup to her lips, holding her gently as she drank. When the girl lay back down, Fletcher spoke without looking up. You were a teacher, weren't you? Beatrice turned. How did you know that? You talked to her like someone who's used to being listened to. He glanced up then, the corners of his eyes still lined with cold. And your books, they're shelved in order of subject. That doesn't happen by accident. She crossed her arms. I taught in Helena before I married. Small school with a dirt floor and a crooked stove. He nodded once. You miss it. I miss being certain of my purpose. But not the rest. Fletcher finished the skinning and set the meat aside. I tried reading once. Properly, I mean. Thought I'd learn about farming. Couldn't keep the words in my head. She moved toward the hearth. You never had schooling? No time for it. My mother died young. My father kept us moving, mining, hauling freight, breaking horses. I learned to ride before I could spell my own name. Beatrice knelt to help him, reaching for the stew pot. You've done more with less. He looked at her, and something softened behind his expression. Doesn't mean I wouldn't have taken more if I'd been given the chance. She stirred the pot slowly. The rabbit meat hissed as it hit the bubbling broth. Outside, the light had turned to amber, catching on the icicles that hung from the eaves. Fletcher sat back on his heels. What was your husband like? She didn't answer at first. Then she wiped her hands on a cloth and sat down beside the hearth, not quite facing him. Sam had a way of making things seem simple, even when they weren't. He worked hard, but he carried it light. He never let me lift the heavy water barrel, even when I said I could. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. You ever wish you hadn't come to these mountains with him? No. She folded her hands in her lap. He wanted land. I wanted quiet. We found both. Just not for long. Fletcher leaned forward, feeding another log to the fire. You think you'll stay here after the thaw? I don't know. She looked toward the window, where dusk was falling fast. I don't let myself think that far ahead anymore. He nodded slowly. I understand that. The quiet between them stretched, but it wasn't hollow. It held weight, like footsteps on hard-packed snow. Beatrice glanced at Kara, who was asleep again, cheeks less pale than they had been. I should mend your coat, she said after a while. That tear on the shoulder's letting in too much cold. I've got thread in my saddlebag, Fletcher replied. Didn't have much use for it on the trail. She stood and crossed to the door, lifting the leather flap he'd hung over the entrance to keep out drafts. The saddlebag was there, tucked beside his rolled blanket. She brought it to the table and opened it carefully. Inside were a few cartridges, a whetstone, a folded piece of cloth, and a small sketchbook, worn at the edges. She paused. I don't mean to pry, she said, fingers brushing the cover. You can look, he said quietly. She opened it. Inside were pencil drawings, some rough, others more careful. A child's face, round and serious. A woman seated beside a wagon. A landscape that looked like the Red Rock River Valley in early spring. Beatrice turned a page. You draw the people you lose? Sometimes, he said. Sometimes I draw the ones I wish I'd known longer. She closed the book gently and placed it back in the bag. You've got a good eye? He gave a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Better than my writing, anyhow. She found the thread and brought it to the table, pulling the coat close. Her needle slid through the fabric with ease, the tear mending beneath her fingers in neat, steady lines. Fletcher sat across from her, hands resting on the rough edge of the table. You could build something here, she said, not looking up. If you wanted. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. I never stayed anywhere long enough to think I could. You could learn. He raised his eyes to hers. Would you want me to? Beatrice tied off the last stitch and set the coat down between them. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin walls, and the air held the scent of pine smoke and boiled meat. She met his gaze without flinching. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't. Outside, the snow had quieted to a hush, and the dark pressed close to the windows. Inside, something had shifted small, but certain, like a seed beneath the frost, waiting for spring. The snow held through the next day, but the sky cleared to a pale blue that stretched wide over the valley. Around midday, Fletcher returned from checking the southern ridge with a quarter of a pine sapling over his shoulder, its bark stripped and branches bundled for kindling. Beatrice was outside when he came back, her sleeves rolled, mending the fence rail closest to the barn's lean-to with a hatchet and a length of rawhide. She didn't look up until he reached her. You're wasting strength hauling that far out, she said, not unkindly. There's more sunlight on that slope, Fletcher replied. Trees grow straighter, easier to split. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. You think of things in terms of ease. I suppose that comes from always moving. I think of things in terms of what gets a person through, he said. Ease has got nothing to do with it. Beatrice nodded once. The back pen's sagging. If we get a thaw, the whole gate'll give. I'll shore it, he said. She handed him the hatchet without a word. Their hands brushed. By dusk, the repairs were done. Fletcher's knuckles were scraped raw where the hide had slipped, and Beatrice's shoulders ached. But the gate held firm when they tested it. Kara had stayed asleep most of the afternoon, lulled by the warmth of the cabin and the rhythm of the windless world outside. Inside, Fletcher cleaned his hands with melted snow, then sat on the bench near the hearth, stretching out his legs as Beatrice stirred the pot again. The scent of the rabbit stew had deepened, richer now with dried sage and a bit of carrot she'd found in the root bin. You ever wonder what you'd be doing now if the world had turned different? She asked, not looking over. Fletcher leaned his head back against the wall. Sometimes. I thought about apprenticing to a smith once. I liked the smell of coal, the sound of steel coming together. My father said I'd get soft. Did you believe him? For a while. Then I stopped believing much of anything he said. Beatrice ladled out the stew and brought it to the table. You ever go back to where you came from? No one left there. Just hills full of quartz and broken promises. She handed him a bowl, then sat across from him. I was born near Warsaw, Missouri. My father ran a dry goods store. He didn't want me teaching. Said it made a woman sharp in ways that made men uneasy. Fletcher took a bite, chewed slowly. He wrong. Yes, she said. But he believed it all the same. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the occasional snap from the hearth. When the bowls were empty, Beatrice set hers aside and leaned her forearms on the table. Do you ever think about children? She asked. Fletcher's eyes settled on hers, steady. I used to, before I saw what it cost to try raising one on the trail. Now, I think about what kind of man I'd have to be to deserve that trust. Beatrice didn't smile, but her gaze softened. You've already earned it from one of us. Kara stirred then, coughing once before settling again. Fletcher turned slightly, watching the girl breathe, her chest rising slow and even beneath the quilt. You should sleep, he said. You've been running on worry for 4 days. I can't, she said. Not while she's still this weak. I'll sit up, he said. Beatrice hesitated, then reached behind her to untie the braid at the nape of her neck. Her hair fell in loose waves, dark and heavy. You'll wake me if she worsens? He nodded. She crossed to the cot and lay beside her daughter, curling her body around the child's. Kara shifted toward the warmth. Fletcher added another log to the fire, then pulled the rifle across his knees and sat back in the rocker, watching the flames move. For a long time, there was no sound but the ticking of the kettle and the shifting of wood. Fletcher, Beatrice said softly, without turning. You could stay after the thaw, if you wanted. His voice, when it came, was quiet. I've been looking a long time for something that felt like it might last. There was no answer, but the stillness in the room changed. Not tense, just full. Like something true had passed between them, and both could hear it breathing. Outside, the trees stood tall and clean against the night sky. And inside, the fire kept burning. In the days that followed, the snow softened under a gentler sun, and the world outside the cabin thawed in slow, deliberate pieces. The ice along the creek loosened its grip, trickling in thin ribbons over rock. Birds began to find their way back to the bare-limbed cottonwoods, calling faintly in the early hours. Beatrice watched it all from the doorway one morning, Kara's weight warm against her hip. The child was stronger now, asking for stories and walking short distances without coughing. Her cheeks had filled again, and she leaned her head against her mother's shoulder as they stood wrapped in a shawl, breathing in air that no longer stung. Behind them, Fletcher laid out a new hinge he'd carved for the barn door, testing the wood's fit with a quiet focus. He had spoken little that morning, but his boots were dry, and his shoulders sat easier, as though some weight had shifted from them. Kara pointed toward the slope beyond the fence. Is there still snow up on the ridge? There is, Beatrice said, but not for much longer. Fletcher looked up. We'll walk up there soon, once it's firm enough underfoot. Views go all the way to the flats. Kara grinned, then nestled closer, already drowsy again. Later, while the girl napped, Beatrice sat beside Fletcher at the table, a length of unbleached muslin in her lap. She was sewing a new pillowcase, her stitches even, though her hands moved slower than usual. You plan on heading to Missoula still? She asked, not looking up. I was, Fletcher said. But plans can turn, given reason. What reason would do it? He set down the chisel he'd been using and met her eyes. What I found here. What I'd be leaving behind. Beatrice let the needle rest. You said once you'd never stayed anywhere long. I've never been given a place worth staying, he said. Not until now. She threaded another length of cotton through the eye of her needle. It isn't an easy life. You know that. I do, he said. But I've had hard before. I haven't had quiet mornings or a roof I helped mend. I haven't had someone who knows how I take my coffee without asking. Her hands paused in their work. You'd stay for small things? I'd stay for them, he said quietly. And for you. The fire hissed in the hearth, a low and steady sound. Beatrice set her sewing aside. You'd need land, she said. Something you could work come spring. There's a stretch just west of here, near that stand of birch. Dry enough, flat enough. It'd take some clearing, but I've seen worse. It was Sam's before, she said. He never got to plant it. Just marked it with stones and said he'd get to it when the time came. Fletcher reached across the table then. His hand closed over hers, calloused and warm. Maybe the time's come now. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she turned her hand over beneath his, lacing their fingers together. That night, as Kara slept beneath a quilt now too small for her lengthening limbs, Beatrice stood brushing her hair before the fire. Fletcher sat behind her, his eyes following the movement of the brush through the dark waves. I didn't think I'd love again, she said, her voice quiet but sure. I thought that part of my life died with him. I didn't think I'd find someone who'd let me build beside them, he said. You've done more than that. She turned, and he stood. They met in the space between firelight and shadow, and when he kissed her, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything more than what was already freely given. When the thaw finished and the ground softened, they walked the land together. Fletcher cleared the marked stretch with his own hands, stacking stones where Sam once had. Beatrice planted seed she'd kept in a muslin pouch at the bottom of her cedar trunk, seeds she'd once thought would never touch soil again. Kara followed behind them, carrying small pails of water and asking questions about roots and sun. By midsummer, Fletcher had built a second room onto the cabin, solid and square, with a new hearth and a window that faced the ridge. He and Beatrice stood in it one evening, watching the lights stretch across the valley. She reached for his hand without speaking, and he leaned into her touch like it was something he'd been waiting on for years. They married when the first frost came back, under the sky where the leaves turned gold and the wind smelled of earth. Just them, Kara, and the preacher from town who rode out with a Bible wrapped in oilcloth and a sack of flour as a gift. There was no crowd, no music, Just the sound of cottonwoods shifting and Kara's soft laughter as she tossed dried petals into the air. Afterward, Beatrice and Fletcher shared bread she'd baked that morning and sat beside the fire, their hands never far from each other. That winter, the snow came again, but not as heavy. The cabin stayed warmer. The woodpile stayed full. And when Kara fell ill with nothing worse than a head cold, Fletcher held her while Beatrice brewed tea, and the girls slept through the night wrapped in both their care. By the next spring, the field Fletcher had cleared sprouted green, beans and squash, and rows of corn that stood taller than Kara by July. The three of them worked it together, and when the day was done, they sat on the porch with the sun dipping low and the air still warm from the day, arms brushing, hearts steady. They didn't talk much in those moments. They didn't need to. Love, once hard won, had settled in quiet and deep. It held like roots under frost, like stone beneath soil. And it stayed.